Linkin Park did not become one of the defining bands of its era by following a clear path. Before the stadiums, before the platinum records, before Chester Bennington's voice became inseparable from a generation's anger and grief, they were a band that almost did not happen. They were rejected repeatedly. Their sound did not fit neatly anywhere, and the singer who would eventually define them was close to walking away from music altogether. That is what makes the story matter. Linkin Park's rise was not just a story of success. It was a story of survival, timing, loyalty, and emotional force. At the center of it was a band built on contrast. Mike Shinoda brought structure, control, and design. Chester Bennington brought volatility, pain, and release. Together, they created a sound that did not simply capture a moment. It gave millions of people a language for what they were feeling. Before the name Linkin Park became globally recognized, the group existed in earlier forms, including Zero and Hybrid Theory. Mike Shinoda was developing material in a home setup while the band struggled to gain industry support. Record labels repeatedly turned them down. One source in the material describes that period through roughly 45 rejections. That detail matters because it shows how far outside the mainstream the band remained before the breakthrough finally came. At the same time, Chester Bennington was in Arizona and moving toward a very different life. He had reached a point where leaving music seemed realistic. Then, the audition opportunity arrived. That moment changed the direction of the band. When Bennington heard the instrumental material, he immediately understood what it could become. What followed was not a routine lineup change. It completed the identity of the group. Mike Shinoda's measured writing and rap delivery gave the music discipline. Bennington's voice gave it rupture. That contrast became the foundation of Linkin Park's sound. It came into full focus with Hybrid Theory. The album did not emerge without conflict. The material you provided shows that the band had to defend its own vision, including Mike Shinoda's place at the creative center. According to that material, there was pressure from the label side to reshape the group. Bennington rejected that idea and defended Shinoda's role directly. That response was more than personal loyalty. It protected the partnership that made the band work. When Hybrid Theory was released on October 24, 2000, it changed the band's position immediately. The album was a commercial breakthrough, but that does not fully explain its impact. Its songs carried pressure, melody against distortion, control against collapse, restraint against emotional overload. Linkin Park did not simply combine rock and rap. They organized conflicting emotional states into a sound that felt immediate and recognizable. That is why the music connected at the scale it did. For many listeners, Chester Bennington became the emotional center of that connection. His voice did not sound polished in the conventional sense. It sounded exposed. It carried vulnerability, anger, exhaustion, and release in a form that many listeners understood without explanation. Songs such as Crawling, Numb, and In the End became more than successful records. They became emotional reference points for people who felt alienated, overwhelmed, or unable to explain what they were carrying. That connection came from something real. Bennington spoke publicly about childhood abuse, the damage it caused, and his long struggle with addiction. In the research material, those experiences are treated as essential context for understanding both his performances and the seriousness of the band's lyrics. He did not turn pain into image. He described it as part of his life. That difference gave his work unusual credibility. But Linkin Park was never built around one person alone. A major theme across the material is the relationship between Chester Bennington and Mike Shinoda. Their partnership was not competitive. It was complementary. Shinoda functioned as the architect, writer, and strategic musical center. Bennington was the voice, the emotional force, and the performer who could turn that structure into impact. The band worked because those roles were different, and because each depended on the other. That creative relationship also gave the band room to grow. Linkin Park did not remain fixed in the exact form of its debut. The documents reference later work, side projects, and Bennington's range beyond the band, including Dead by Sunrise and Stone Temple Pilots. They also show that the band used its visibility for work beyond music. In 2005, Linkin Park helped found Music for Relief, connecting its public platform to disaster response and humanitarian efforts. By then, the scale of Linkin Park's success was unmistakable. So was the private strain beneath it. Chester Bennington remained open. At different moments in his life, about depression, addiction, and the difficulty of staying stable, even as Linkin Park became one of the biggest bands in the world. That honesty mattered. It changed the way many listeners understood the music. The songs did not feel detached from real life. They felt lived in. They felt earned. They came from someone who is not performing pain as an image, but trying to work through it in public, through music, in real time. That became part of Linkin Park's legacy. It helped place mental health in a different frame. Not as a distant issue, not as a subject reserved for private collapse, but as something that could exist alongside success, talent, family, visibility, and achievement. For a generation of listeners, that made the band's music more than catharsis. It made it recognition. People did not only hear Chester Bennington, they heard themselves in him. They heard fear, anger, shame, exhaustion, and survival. They heard someone giving shape to emotions that often stayed buried or unnamed. Then the story changed permanently. On July 20th, 2017, Chester Bennington died at the age of 41. The loss moved far beyond the band itself. It reached the audience that had grown up with this music, relied on it, and attached parts of their own lives to it. For many listeners, this did not register as the death of a distant public figure. It felt personal. It felt personal because the music had already made it personal. For years, Linkin Park had occupied a place that few bands ever reach. The songs were not just known, they were used to survive difficult periods, used to process anger, used to sit with grief, used to endure isolation, used to make sense of emotions that were otherwise difficult to explain. That is why the loss landed with such force. What disappeared was not only a singer, it was a voice people had tied to their own internal lives. A voice that had helped many listeners feel less alone at the moments when they were most overwhelmed. And yet the legacy did not end there. Linkin Park's legacy continues to hold because it was never built on sales alone, or genre influence alone, or cultural scale alone, even though all of those mattered. Its staying power comes from endurance, emotional precision, and honesty. The band translated confusion, anger, shame, grief, and inner conflict into songs that people could live with. Not just admire, not just remember, live with. That is a different kind of impact. Hybrid Theory and the records that followed helped define an era of modern rock. But the larger legacy goes beyond style or genre. Linkin Park gave shape to feelings that were often difficult to name. And Chester Bennington, in particular, became a figure through whom millions of listeners felt recognized. That is why the music lasted. Not because it captured a passing trend, but because it captured something ongoing and human. Something unresolved. Something people continue to carry. Linkin Park's story is not only about success after rejection or tragedy after fame. It is about collaboration, honesty, resilience, and survival. It is about a band that held together long enough to change the sound of its time, and a singer whose voice made private pain legible in public. That is why Linkin Park still matters. That is why the music continues to endure across generations.